We're going to break in there to take you back to the UN Security Council and listen to the state of Palestine speaking in the chamber.
And there is no right to annexation. This is what Israel is doing in Gaza. These are its war objectives. This is what the absence of a ceasefire is allowing it to continue doing. This full-fledged Israeli assault against the Palestinian people and the Palestinian land is about everything except the hostages. If the families of hostages can see that, how can anyone in this room claim otherwise? A ceasefire will allow to save lives, all lives. This was true a year ago. This is even more true today. A ceasefire doesn't resolve everything, but it is the first step towards resolving anything. And what is the answer of those who are still unwilling now, after all this death and destruction, not to call for an unconditional ceasefire? Is it to accept that the killing should continue until we resolve everything, while we watch that we are resolving nothing? We heard over and over again statements in this chamber by all members without distinction about protection of civilians, about rejecting forcible displacement, about rejecting starving the Palestinian population, about rejecting annexation, about rejecting wanton destruction, about rejecting regional escalation. Everyone around this table agreed on these objectives, and yet here we are. 44,000 Palestinians killed. This is those who are accounted for. Many more are not accounted for. One day we will retrieve them in mass graves under the rubbles, and we will discover the real numbers of this horror. And there will be many that we will never retrieve. Famine that is looming all over Gaza, that is a reality in northern Gaza. 2 million people displaced, still hunted even when they are in tents. Total destruction of Gaza and all the requirements of life in it. And war on Lebanon, its people and its sovereignty. What does it mean to proclaim all these principles, we reject, we reject, we reject, and then shield Israel of the consequences of its actions, thus allowing it to do exactly what we're asking it to stop doing? Madam President, the world should not grow accustomed to the death of Palestinians, to seeing Palestinian children starving, to seeing mothers carrying their children from one place to another, forcibly displaced. They should not get accustomed to seeing journalists killed and humanitarians killed, to see Palestinians detained, abducted, carried on trucks to go be tortured, sexually abused, and raped. The fact we are Palestinians does not make that less shocking or less outrageous. Maybe for some we have the wrong nationality, the wrong faith, the wrong skin color. But we are humans, and we should be treated as such. Is there a UN charter for Israel that is different from the charter you all have? Tell us. Is there an international law for them, an international law for us? Do they have the right to kill, and the only right we have is to die? What the hell does Israel need to do more for this council to act under Chapter 7? What more can they do for this council to act under Chapter 7? Or will this council be the last place on earth that cannot recognize a threat to peace when they see it? When it is so glaring, so undeniable? You are witnessing the attempt to annihilate a nation, destroy a nation. It is not even hidden. It is in plain sight. And yet the very tools designed to respond to these situations are not being used. So which one is it? Are Palestinian lives not worth saving? Or does Israel have a license to kill? Can this council only adopt resolutions and then witness their blatant breach? This self-inflicted powerlessness has to stop. And like Algeria, we repeat, The resolutions of this Council are binding. Their role is to be enforced. Their role is to change reality, not to record violations for history's purposes and then allow them to continue. Had diplomatic efforts succeeded, we would not be here. We recognize all the efforts that were done, all the diplomatic efforts that were conducted. And yet, we have to recognize children are still starving in Gaza. Families are being killed. Communities are being obliterated. Had these efforts succeeded, we would not be here. But what we cannot accept is that Israel has a veto that blocks any attempts to put an end to this war, especially when we know what are its true intentions. Madam President, many peoples, many governments around the world are saying the right things and trying to do the right things. And we have here to express our gratitude to the E10 for their relentless efforts for over a year now, and in the recent month. We all were hoping that 2735 would lead to a ceasefire. And we can discuss who is responsible for that ceasefire not occurring. For us, it is pretty clear that Israel had never an intention to accept a ceasefire and has found every reason not to have a ceasefire. We thank Guyana for its efforts in coordinating the E10 initiative. We thank all of those who have voted in favor of this resolution, and we agree with Malta and with Algeria. This is the bare minimum. This is the bare minimum that morality, humanity, legality would plead for. And this bare minimum, even this bare minimum, was vetoed. I truly do not understand, and you're saying we cannot be for an unconditional ceasefire. What that means in effect now is that we are for a war. You're saying we cannot be for an unconditional ceasefire that does not release the hostages. Is this war releasing the hostages? Is it even trying to release the hostages? So what does it mean? We accept this war that is killing hostages and that is killing, maiming, terrorizing, destroying an entire nation? When is it enough? When is it the point where we say, no, we mean ceasefire now, now. We will not allow you to not listen to us, to ignore us, to insult us, to play games with us. This resolution is trying to restore life, to save lives. It's not a dangerous message. The draft resolution is not a dangerous message. This veto is a dangerous message to Israel that it can continue executing its plans, the very plans you oppose. And the messages we send do matter. And that is the wrong message at the worst possible time. Israel is responsible for the Palestinian civilians it kills. It cannot be absolved of that responsibility. It is killing them purposefully, deliberately, repeatedly, massively. It is starving them on purpose. Nobody can deny it. We sat in this room, we heard every UN agency, every testimony, every NGO, Palestinian, Israeli, international, saying the same things. This is by design. What does it mean that release of the hostages should be unconditional? This is what the Council has said repeatedly now for a year. Release of hostages should be unconditional. But stopping killing Palestinians is conditional? There are acceptable conditions to stop the mass killing of Palestinians? There's 100 Israeli hostages, and there's 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. They deserve better. They deserve respect for their lives, for their suffering. Israel will always claim conditions have not been met because its plans require it to continue this war, to annex the land and destroy the people. And therefore, we can no longer accept its conditions. 14 months, and we are still debating if a genocide must be stopped. There's no justification whatsoever for vetoing a resolution trying to stop atrocities. No justification for that. Madam President, One day someone will dig up these meetings, the records of them, will see us pleading for the lives of our people over and over and over and over again. And they will try to understand why our calls were not heeded. They will look at the people who sat around this table and spoke and addressed you from all over the world to call on the Council to take action. They will read what everybody here has said. And then they will wonder how a genocide displayed on TVs known to the whole world was able to continue for this long. They will wonder if the whole world is against the mass killing, against the displacement, against the starvation, against the annexation, how come they all occurred? It is because we are allowed to speak about the rules, but not to enforce them. Because we can regret and reject, but not act. There are many states now stepping up to change this reality. We call on all states and all peoples to stand for life, for freedom, and for peace. We are out of time. We repeat, we are against harming any civilians. And we have more than our share of grievances. We could have sat here and tried to justify harming civilians. We never did, not one day. And we're still sitting here after tens of thousands of our people have been killed. Many have been detained. All have been traumatized. All have been displaced. We have many reasons to say otherwise, and yet we remain steadfast. There is no reason to harm civilians, regardless of their nationality, their origin, regardless of the circumstances. But our civilians, what about our civilians? They are worthy of protection. Their lives should be saved. People cannot sit and demand Palestinian pacifism under all circumstances and enable Israeli militarism. That cannot be done. Either you believe violence is an impasse, you believe there are no military solutions, and then you act for peaceful ones and reject military ones, or you let it be military. We are for a peaceful path. Even after all that has happened, we are for a peaceful path. Help us chart it, not block it. Stop them. Help us. You would be helping Palestinians and Israelis in our region and the world. Madam President, there is a world out there where Palestinian children are able to grow. We are not born to be occupied and killed and displaced. That's not our destiny, that's not our fate. There is a world where we could live and grow and see our children grow with no occupation, no bombs, no tents, no settlements, no walls, no military checkpoints, no prisons, no constant humiliation, no oppression, no house demolished, no amputations, no pain and no agony. That world can exist today if we were to act. And the fact we are not means that many, many more Palestinians will suffer and others will suffer. We are trying to get there. We are trying to find a path that leads us there, to freedom, to life, and to peace. That should be our common objective. There is a world where there's no war in the Middle East, where Palestinians and Israeli civilians go about their lives, where maybe they can look confidently towards the future and even envisage more bridges between them, where our region unleashes its true and full potential for the benefit of all states and all peoples. It's this future that is being destroyed before our very eyes. And the entire Palestinian civilian population is the primary victim. Madam President, we call on the General Assembly to uphold the responsibilities that the Council has failed to uphold, owing to the US veto. We call on all states to use all available tools to stop the massacres. What this resolution was calling for is an unconditional end to massacres, and that is always worth supporting.
I thank the representative of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. Before I start, I have listened to your speech very carefully. and you mention a future with no pain, no suffering, but you haven't mentioned one word during your speech, and I've listened very carefully. What about Hamas? You have to include in your speech a future for Gaza is a future with no Hamas. You cannot describe a world or reality and not mentioning the reason why we are sitting in this room today, the brutality of Hamas and the pain that the people of Gaza are suffering because of Hamas. Madam President, today most of the members of this council failed. They betrayed their own principles, their responsibilities to the innocent, and their duty to uphold justice. The resolution brought before this chamber was not a path to peace. It was a roadmap to more terror, more suffering, and more bloodshed. Many of you attempted to pass this injustice. We thank the United States for exercising its veto, for standing on the side of morality and justice, for refusing to abandon the hostages and their families. The text ignored the suffering of the 101 innocent hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza. Had it passed today, this Council would have sent a message to the world that terrorists can act with impunity, that the United Nations will shield and surrender to murderers, rapists, and kidnappers, rather than holding them accountable. Last week, Sasha Trofanov should have celebrated his 29th birthday, surrounded by friends and family. Instead, he is being held by terrorist monsters who recently released a video showcasing his torture. Sasha is starved, his face bruised, his spirit crushed. Hamas doesn't just imprison, they torment, they dehumanize, they rejoice in their cruelty, and now they know that this council will do nothing to stop them. I would like to remind Ambassador Navzia that Sasha is a Russian citizen. He is included in the 29 nations which have citizens held hostage by Hamas, your citizens. Neama Levy, a bright young woman, just 19 years old, was taken and dragged into hell. Neama volunteered at a kindergarten for refugees, bringing light and love to children in need. You have seen the horrible images. Her ankles cut, her sweatpants soaked in blood. Neama's innocence, her humanity, her dreams, all stolen by Hamas. And today, someone in this council told her family that her life is not worth enough to demand her freedom. Those who supported this resolution have announced to the world Sasha's life, Naama's life, and the lives of 99 other innocent people are not valuable enough to be a condition for a ceasefire. Today, the UN celebrates International Children's Day. Rather than demanding that little children like Ariel and Kfir Bivas will be released immediately after 411 days in captivity, this council is attempting to pass a resolution which declares that their precious lives are not worth your time. This is not diplomacy. It is appeasement. It is abandonment of the very ideal that this council claims to defend. The world should be clear-eyed about what this text truly represents. It rewards Hamas for their barbarity. It validates their strategy of using human shields, targeting civilians, and tormenting hostages in their terror dungeons. It would have set a horrifying precedent that terrorism pays, that violence is met not with condemnation, but with concessions. Why you couldn't agree about condemnation of Hamas? You mentioned you worked tirelessly about drafting this resolution. Couldn't you sit down, the 14 countries who voted for that, and agree about a condemnation in this resolution? Like one line? We condemn the atrocities of Hamas? Was it so difficult? This council has already adopted 4 resolutions demanding the release of the hostages. Hamas has ignored every one of them. Why wouldn't they? They have faced no consequences for their crimes, no repercussions for their atrocities, no accountability for their barbarity. Madam President, the loss of civilian life in Gaza is a tragedy. But it is a tragedy authored by Hamas. They started this war. You have to say it. You have to say that they started it on October 7th. We are not here because we wanted to be here. They have held innocent Israelis hostage for over 400 days, with no sign of life or humanitarian access. They use Palestinian civilians as human shields. If this council fails to place the blame on the terrorists, it only emboldens them further. Israel will continue to defend itself. We will never abandon our hostages. And you have to understand that. Look at your values and understand why. We will never forget them, and we will never stop fighting for their freedom. If Hamas were to release the hostages and surrender their weapons, not one more shot would need to be fired. But until that day comes, Israel will do whatever it takes to protect its people and bring our loved ones home. Today, this council had the opportunity to stand on the side of justice, decency, and humanity. If not for the United States, it would have chosen appeasement, to reward terror and abandon the innocent. History will remember this vote. It will remember who stood with the hostages, the victims, and the principles of peace, and who betrayed them to shield terrorists. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
There we have been listening in to the UN Security Council in New York. We were last hearing there Danon, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, commending the US for just vetoing yet another UN resolution that was calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. He followed an emotional speech that was full of anguish by the Palestinian representative to the UN, who said, "We are out of time. 14 months and we're still debating whether genocide must be stopped. And there's no justification," he said, "for that." Let's bring in our correspondent, Gabriel Elizondo. He's been also listening in at the United Nations headquarters there in New York. Gabe, first of all, before we get on to the speeches, just talk us through what was in this latest draft resolution and why the US vetoed it.
Yeah, very good question. Let's get back to the basic facts here and what is in it. And I'm also going to mention what was not in it, which is also very important. But essentially what was in this draft resolution that was negotiated for over 3 weeks, spearheaded, as we've been reporting, by the E10, the elected 10 members of the council. It called for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire to be respected by all parties. And it demanded the immediate and unconditional release of all captives. That was sort of the headline from this two-page draft resolution. There were some other things in there as well, important things such as calling for UNRWA to be supported and fully funded and not attacked. So it was interesting language and supporting language of UNRWA. Of course, it has come under attack from Israel now for 14 months. But this is important, if you allow me, what was not in this draft. Initially, what was in this draft was Chapter 7 language. Now, what's that? That would have added a lot of teeth to this resolution. That essentially would have given the Council legal framework, if you will, to take more forceful measures such as force and or sanctions if Israel did not abide by this. Well, the U.S. said we're never going to agree to this, so the U.S. demanded that Chapter 7 language come out during the negotiation process. The negotiators took that out at the request of the U.S., hoping they could get the U.S. to at least abstain to have this resolution go through, a watered-down version. even that, as we're now reporting, as we saw this morning, even that now has been vetoed by the United States. And that's why I think you saw a lot of frustration in many of the speeches that we heard from member states.
Indeed, we even heard the Russian ambassador calling it Groundhog Day, because the council has been here so many times discussing the situation in Gaza, hearing impassioned pleas from the Palestinians, defiance from the Israelis. I mean, the speeches don't change, do they? The essence of what every country is saying, the stance that they're taking, it remains as entrenched as ever.
It really does, and I think that's why you're seeing frustration, because we've had 12 different draft resolutions go to a vote by the Security Council in the last 14 months. 12. 4 of them have been adopted. The most recently, just back in June, a scaled-in ceasefire resolution that has not been abided by. And so you are seeing some of the same language, and that's why the E10, the elected 10, have come together to say, we want this resolution, and they really wanted that Chapter 7 language put in there, and everyone was quite frankly disappointed, including the Palestinians, that was taken out. But the E10 said, listen, we've got to take it out in order to get the U.S. on board. They continued negotiations behind closed doors for days. And even with the watered-down version, the U.S. vetoed it. And I think that's why you're seeing so much frustration, and why you're seeing so many member states in their council members, I should say, in their speeches, saying the council has failed in Gaza.
OK, Gabriel Elizondo joining us there from the United Nations. Many thanks, Gabe.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.